your words are being turned into my gobbledygook by an AI translator. Okay, I think we're live now. Great. So welcome to all of you. Let me welcome you all on today, International Women's Day, and wish you all a happy Women's Day. To this very special event, Failing to Win, Hard-Earned Lessons from a Purpose-Driven Startup. My name is Jean-Paul Feguet, and I'm a professor of political economy of development here at the LSE in the Department of International Development. And I had the great pleasure to teach Mike 15 years ago, a little bit more, when he was a master's student here. I remember Mike came to us as an engineer from Canada, and he was very, very friendly and open, like Canadians tend to be, quite driven. He had a kind of a quiet intensity about him. He would think hard before he said anything in class, but then when he said something, it behooved you to listen, because he always had something to say. And he seemed to have an ability to see through knotty problems to the core of an issue and not get distracted by details or color. Sort of see the most important things in the really difficult problems that we analyze, that we force our students to analyze on this course. So let me introduce to you a little bit more about Mike, and then I'll hand over to him. As I said, Mike did his MSc Development Management at the LSE in 2006, 2007. He also did an MBA from the Said Business School at Oxford, where he was a Skoll Scholar for Social Entrepreneurship. He's been recognized by the Edward Claugus Award for Leadership and Innovation in Financial Inclusion from Axion, and the Social Entrepreneur of the Year prize from the Charles Schwab Foundation. Without further ado, Mike is going to tell you much more about his trajectory and about this startup that he founded in particular in Africa. So welcome to all of you. Warm welcome to Mike, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, JP. And it's such an honor to be, I'd love to say to be back at LSE, but as you can see, I'm at home in North London, but to actually be invited to give a public lecture is a real honor. More than 15 years after I attended there. So let me just share my screen and then I can jump in. So just confirm, JP, you can see. So we're good to go. Okay, so I'm going to just give a talk on this about co-founding one of the very first purpose-driven fintech businesses in Africa back in 2009. But before I get there, I'll just give you a little bit of context of who I am, because I'm sure the vast majority of people don't know who I am. Unlike many of the esteemed speakers at LSE, I'm certainly not famous, so this is a real privilege. Then I'll talk about the Zona story, which is the name of the startup that I co-founded, and then end with some of the hard-earned lessons that I learned on this journey, which was an amazing experience for me. So, but very briefly, as you can probably tell, I'm not from Africa. I'm from a very far away place called Calgary in Canada. It's most famous for a hockey arena that's shaped like a saddle, actually called the Saddle Dome. And then the 1988 Winter Olympics, where we actually had the real story of the Jamaican bobsled team and Eddie the Eagle, both made into movies. So my life certainly wasn't destined to become a fintech entrepreneur in Africa. I very much stumbled across or upon this quite late when I grew up. I was the son of two high school teachers, and I went to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and I studied mechanical engineering. So this was back in like 1998 to 2003. And while I was at UBC, I stumbled across a startup organization at the time. It was called Engineers Without Borders. It was brand new, and they had chapters at all the different universities with quite a strong appeal for people who were studying engineering to join, learn about international development issues, poverty issues, emerging markets, and then when you graduated, they would send you on volunteer placements. And at the time, when I graduated in 2003, I got sent to Ghana, and I spent about a year working in Ghana in the capital city, Accra, for half my placement, and then the second half in a rural village along the Cote d'Ivoire border. And we were working with supporting a husband and wife entrepreneur team to set up a very simple machine. It was a diesel-powered engine that could power agro-processing machinery for the purposes of saving women time and labor. So I think very, very fitting to the theme of International Women's Day. And this was in a community of about 2,000 people that didn't have electricity. So you could use this diesel-powered engine to save women a tremendous amount of time and energy from doing manual agro-processing, and then turn it into a business. And it was really the first experience I had in a developing country with simple application of very simple technology. Nothing like what I went on to do, but just like conceptually a major turning point to my life. Ultimately, the project didn't work. It was kind of the first failure that I experienced, like big ambitions and good intentions, but parts of it worked, but it wasn't scalable. It was donor funded. And ultimately, I wasn't there for the long run. So I spent a year volunteering, went back to Canada, and actually one of the second turning points, which was one of the biggest impacts I actually had in this volunteer placement that was unexpected, was I wrote a blog that got picked up by this international musician from Canada, Sarah McLaughlin, that many people will know, who ended up featuring it in her music video, World on Fire, and featuring my friend Christy, who was this orange seller on the streets of Accra that I befriended. And this music video ended up getting nominated for a Grammy Award, and she donated a whole bunch of money to Engineers Without Borders and other charities around the world. And it was a learning around the impact that you can have by using your voice. So even though I went there to like have all this impact on this project that was kind of moderately successful, the biggest thing I learned was like I wrote a blog and suddenly got picked up and went viral, and inspired me to, I think, keep going on this journey. And I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up at the time. This was very much like volunteer placement to go find myself, but I signed up for a second placement with the same organization and ended up going to Zambia in Southern Africa this time. Spent a year and a half working with small-scale farmers along the Zimbabwe border, the Zambia-Zimbabwe border, and working with them to grow a drought-resistant cereal crop that was used for the supply of actually a beer product. So the local brewery, Zambian Breweries, was purchasing sorghum as the name of the crop. And why this was significant was because this was in a very drought-prone area where people grew maize. The government incentives had been set, and the infrastructure had been set up for decades to promote maize production, but it wasn't suited to the soil. Climate was changing, and there were just very frequent droughts where people would go hungry and literally starve to death. And then suddenly a beer company comes along and says, we are producing this new beer and we want to source sorghum that's locally produced. It's much better suited to the soil. And I got to manage this project run by an NGO. And it was this light bulb moment for me around like the power of a market incentive. It was very controversial at the time too, of a beer company partnering with an NGO to work with small scale farmers who could, change their behavior and grow a new type of crop that if their maize failed, they could eat, and if their maize didn't fail, they could sell and kind of get some income security from this. Again, the project wasn't successful in scaling up, but it was like very foundational in what I learned. They then sent me to LSE. So at the end of that experience, I started realizing that in order to have real impact in Africa and just like in the world, I needed to make a commitment and do it for the long run. So these like 1 year volunteer placements were amazing learning experience for me, but wasn't anything that I could really write home about in terms of what I achieved. And I had just way more questions than answers. So I was trying to understand like why have these development initiatives and these projects been tried over and over and over again, and the ones that get going don't seem to be able to scale up, and then many of them fail. So I applied to the LSE Development Management Program. Had an amazing year. JP was my professor. The biggest impact there on my life was I met my now wife in the course, Isabel. So that was certainly unexpected, but it was, we have 2 kids and we live in London, and we ended up moving to Zambia together after this. And while I was at LSE, I applied to the Oxford MBA program on where I was awarded a scholarship for social entrepreneurship, and very lucky, very privileged and very lucky, because it was at a time where social entrepreneurship was a bit of a buzzword. People were asking what it was and why it had a place in a business school. And I think out of the 5 scholarships that Oxford gave, there was like 7 people that applied to it. So I think luck and timing have a lot to do in my career trajectory. But I was able to kind of put together all these different pieces of experience, like being an engineer and then going and working as a volunteer in Africa on rural agriculture projects, and then studying international development, and then studying business. And I made a commitment while I was at Oxford that I wanted to move back to Zambia and do something for the next 10 years. That was the mission, but I didn't actually know what. I just wanted to make a long-term commitment. And I came up with this idea to start a business called African Enterprise Partners to connect investors with entrepreneurs on the ground who were building purpose-driven but scalable ventures. And I kept meeting, like when I was at Oxford, all of these investors in like London and people that would come do guest lectures talking about like funding social entrepreneurs, but they didn't have deal flow. They didn't know where to find the entrepreneurs. They didn't have teams of people on the ground. The idea that you could just like wire somebody money and then a business would magically appear, without all of the effort in actually building those businesses was a far stretch. So with African Enterprise Partners, the idea was that I would connect the investors with the entrepreneurs, but then I would stay and actually work to build the company from the ground up and make sure I could make a commitment for the long run to really have an impact, which is where the Zona story starts. So that's just a very brief background of how I got into this space. But really the meat of the story starts in January 2009, where I got a consulting contract for an impact investor that was called the Grassroots Business Fund. They bought me a plane ticket to fly back to Zambia and said they would love to find opportunities to invest in. They had an office in Washington, and so for me to approach them and to say, I will move to Lusaka and do the scouting for you and then stick around and help build the business was a strong value proposition. And the first day I arrived in Lusaka, which is the capital city of Zambia, I met these 2 brothers, Brad and Brett McGrath. They were multi-time entrepreneurs. They had run a business previously in the mobile phone industry selling airtime. Both were Zambian, even though they're white Zambians, but they're 3rd generation. And I knew nothing about mobile money or mobile technology. And this was pre-iPhone, so there was no smartphones in the market. But when I got introduced to these 2 guys, and then I learned a little bit of the technology they had built, and they were working with a cotton company that was called Dunavant that had 150,000 small-scale farmers across rural Zambia. And these farmers were paid $30 million US over a 3-month period. So they would plant in the planting season, which I think was October, November, provide, like Dunavant would provide inputs like seeds and fertilizers on loan. They would harvest their crops in May. And then Dunavant would take trucks full of cash with 8 armed guards with AK-47s to buy the cotton from the small scale farmers. And everything was manual. So the cash would move from like banks in the city or in the big towns to the rural areas. Pieces of paper would be signed with like thumbprints from the farmers. The majority of them were illiterate. The reconciliation of the paper trail would be done back at the head office. So you can just imagine like the inefficiency, the theft, the fraud, the risk from moving $30 million a year of cash. And Brad and Brett had built this technology where suddenly now one of the Dunavant employees in the right-hand side of this picture could take a little netbook computer with a GPRS dongle. So this was, pre-3G and 4G. It was Edge and GPRS internet connection, so very slow, but it worked. that could sit there in very remote areas as long as there was a data connection. And then every time there was a cotton purchase from a farmer, that information would be beamed to a centralized server on the cloud in Geneva that their head office was using to lock in forward trades on the world cotton market. And so this was like, it was quite revolutionary, of like a corporate guy sitting in Geneva doing cotton trades, and now could see real-time purchases in rural Zambia. And so I was like just enthralled by this technology. And the vision of Brad and Brett also was to create a digital rural economy. So they were starting with this, but they had this vision of saying, you know, in 5 years' time, all of these farmers are going to have cell phone. So they could have mobile wallets where they can access financial services and you know, never have to touch cash again, and they can be paid digitally. So the digital world that we live in now, they were kind of envisioning this for rural Africa, and even the vision beyond Zambia. I remember asking Brad, like, what do you want this business to be? And he said, a cashless Africa. Like that's the mission of the company. Meanwhile, what was happening in parallel, a much more well-known story, there was an innovation called M-Pesa that was launched by a Vodafone subsidiary, Safaricom, which is the largest telco in East Africa. And M-Pesa was really the world's first like mobile banking product. Again, pre-smartphone. And it was the ability for people using very simple like Nokia phones to digitally store money and then to send and receive money back and forth to each other. And in an economy where 80% of the adults are unbanked, and like the fundamental need of moving money around to pay for school fees or health emergencies or businesses paying their suppliers, like this is such a common and ubiquitous need for people. This took off like wildfire, and it especially spread where there was some post-election violence in Kenya, and all of the banks shut down and the post office shut down. And nobody had ways of moving money around for a couple of weeks other than M-Pesa, and then it went viral. And today, you know, 15 years later, it's grown to a complete like monopoly of the Kenyan economy in terms of the payment systems. It's bigger than all the banks combined. It's moving billions of dollars a month, and you know you'll be hard-strung to find somebody in Kenya that doesn't use M-Pesa almost daily. To buy, you know, whether it's buying a Coke at a store, the groceries, or tickets for Kenyan Airways. You can do everything on M-Pesa now. So back in like 2009, when I met Brad and Brett, this was just starting, and we were hearing about it, but I'd never heard of it before. And mobile money was just this brand new thing, and it didn't exist yet in the Zambia market. But then we started talking about, well, like, what if we actually take this innovation and bring it to Zambia? And I helped close the first $200,000 investment from the Grassroots Business Fund into the company. And it turns out like the challenge with payments in agriculture is they're very seasonal and they're very lumpy. So that $30 million a year over 3 months, you have 9 months where nothing happens. And there's no cash flow coming into the company. And then also it's very challenging rural payments where as soon as a farmer receives like a digital payment, the first thing that farmer wants to do is liquidate it into cash, because he can't do anything, or she can't do anything with mobile money when there's nowhere to spend it. And so we were really inspired by M-Pesa in Kenya, saying, well, you know, maybe we can get into like the person-to-person money transfer space, doing urban to urban transfers that can be regular and all year round, and start generating cash flow for the business. And the innovation that we actually borrowed from M-Pesa that we found most compelling wasn't the fact that you could use your phone to store and send money. It was the agent network. And what the M-Pesa model created was a human-powered like ATM machine, where an individual with a mobile phone and a cash box could be like a bank branch. And then as long as you have a data connection, that agent could do cash in, cash out transactions for consumers in his or her community, earn a commission on every transaction. So it's a business opportunity, a little bit like, you know, like the Uber model, where an Uber driver doesn't, you know, it doesn't work for a taxi company, can own her own vehicle. Then this can, if you set up an agent in any community, whether it's the city, center of the city or somewhere rural, that agent can then provide a hub for people to do cash in, cash out money transfers that can be sent from one place to another place. And so we took this innovation and then brought it to Zambia and started setting up agents. And so this is one of our very first agents in Lusaka. We had hand-painted posters that showed the different pricing tiers and the fees that people could send money. And I would love to say it just like took off instantly, but it was really hard. Just a lot of time and effort doing direct marketing, pulling people in, handing out flyers, getting people to try the service. But every time we acquired a customer, we would actually acquire two, because there would be a sender and then the receiver would go to another agent and withdraw the cash, and then they would repeat every couple of weeks, because people had this need to send money within the economy. None of these people were banked, so there was no other way of doing it other than physically moving cash around. So we were just very early in the market. And fast forward now into 2012, and we ended up raising one of the very first, if not the first, Series A venture investment round in Africa. It was led by the Omidyar Network and Axion. Both those funds have actually spun off emerging markets global fintech funds now, but we were their first investments. We raised a $4 million round in 2012. And so it was like the 2009 to 2012 when we started was like the book I wrote. It's the first 2 chapters are dedicated to it of all of the blood, sweat, and tears, and setting up agents one by one, constantly running out of cash. One of the things I ended up doing was convince my parents back in Canada to mortgage their house. One of our cash crises when we ran out of cash, and they lent me $100,000 so I could put it into the business and keep the business afloat. So we were bootstrapping and just like pulling in money from friends, family, whatever investment we could find. And then 2012, we got this big investment. So this $4 million investment, which was really about like scaling up the business. And at that time, we had a few thousand customers, a couple dozen agents. So it was still a very small business, but we had this network where people could send money from one town to the other town, and we were building like the backbone and the infrastructure across Zambia. We started modularizing our agents, so we then produced these little metal kiosks. So the green ones here, we changed the branding. Initially, it was called Mobile Transactions, and then we changed it to Zona, which means it's real. And then the telcos in the market woke up. So that M-Pesa innovation in Kenya. Suddenly, all of the mobile operators were also studying it, and the 2 big ones in Zambia were called Airtel, which was a big Indian multinational, and then MTN, a South African multinational. They copied M-Pesa, and then they rolled it out into all of their markets. So it was Airtel money and MTN money, not very originally, but they had like big subscriber bases. They already had like millions of people using SIM cards and talking on the phone with them. So they already had a customer base, whereas we were building it one at a time. And then they had big distribution bases because they had all of these small mom and pop shops in the market to sell scratch cards to consumers. But when they launched, they actually didn't get very much traction. So they saw like Zoona in Zambia, and we had customers showing up to our kiosks, and overnight they attacked us. So this picture is back in, I think, early 2013. We woke up one morning and MTN, the yellow guys, put a kiosk right next door to every one of our kiosks across the country. So close that some of our agents couldn't even open the door. They had to crawl in through the window. They made theirs bigger. This is like a huge company that did this. So they made theirs taller so it would stand out more. Airtel then attacked us and differentiated from MTN and us by copying our design, but adding a second window. So they went wider. And this was right after we had raised this investment. So we just taken this global money, and then suddenly the 2 biggest, deepest pocketed companies in the market like attack us in this small African market. And I remember one of the first board meetings, and our investors were just, panicking about this. And we took a deep breath and said, if our only differentiation is the shape of the kiosk, then we actually don't really have a business. And what we inherently knew, that we ended up proving, was that we weren't competing with the mobile operators that launched these kiosks. We were competing with that blue minibus in the background of the picture, because that was how people actually moved cash, right? So nobody was used to using mobile money. Nobody had bank accounts or mobile wallets or smartphones. People were just used to carrying bags of cash around, and sometimes even going to the bus station and giving a bag of cash to a driver and paying a fee for that driver to take it to another town. So what ended up happening was we started gaining confidence, because this competitive attack started driving our business. It created all this awareness in the market, and our numbers improved every month. And we had a better service because we really focused on the experience, the customer experience, making sure our agents always had liquidity. We provided loans to the agents and all of the floats, so that if a customer went to cash out a money transfer, the money was always there. We paid them well. Even though they were independent entrepreneurs, they earned good commissions, so they started making money. And then we started dreaming bigger, and we said, this was a newspaper article back in 2014 around our vision to democratize banking, and we started thinking about what if we turn this into really a digital bank for the future, that you now see in the market. In the UK, you have Revolut and Tide and Monzo and all of these digital banks that have really taken off during COVID and are becoming quite successful. And we were thinking about this in Zambia back in 2014. Then we launched in Malawi, the country next door. And you can see the blue line on this graph was the Zambia traction. So it really took us 4 years to hit that inflection point. And that's what you don't learn in business school about starting a business. If anybody told you how hard it is to start a business, nobody would do it, right? It does take a long time sometimes to hit the inflection point. You don't just start and it just takes off. But then when we launched in Malawi, the opposite was true. Because we had a working model, a good product. We had figured out the operations, the technology was working. And in the first year of Malawi, we achieved what took us the first 4 years in Zambia. And then we were off to the races at this part. We turned profitable, and we went into a board meeting. I remember, and our board was saying, how many countries can we launch in the next year? And this vision of a cashless Africa that we had really felt like it was becoming true, right? We thought we were off to the races, and we ended up then doing a partnership in Malawi with an international remittance company called Makuru that really turbocharged the model. And Makuru had a whole bunch of people in South Africa that were sending money into Zimbabwe during hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. So they became the de facto way of there was a couple million Zimbabweans that emigrated to South Africa and then would send most of their paychecks back to their relatives. And they had this corridor that made them a very successful business in Zimbabwe, and they wanted to expand. And so we had built this agent network in Zambia and Malawi, and we integrated our systems with them, switched on Zambia. The growth was quite slow for whatever reason. It didn't really take off, but when we turned on Malawi, it just exploded. And there was over 1 million Malawians in South Africa that would send up to 50% of their monthly income back to their relatives, but there was no way for these people to actually receive money. So again, it was all through informal networks. And within a couple of years, the corridor that we opened up from South Africa to Malawi for remittances became the fastest growing corridor in Africa of remittances. It was, I think, 3 times bigger than what the World Bank estimated, and it became over 2% of Malawi's GDP. So it was a very successful project. This was a picture on Christmas Eve one year. You can see the demand of all of these customers going to receive money that had been sent to them by a Makuru at a Zona agent. And our agent would have to go to bank branches to get cash. And then on this particular day, we ended up breaking 4 banks in Malawi nationwide, where all of the banks ran out of cash, because our agents would go get cash, go back to the kiosk, pay it out, and run out of cash again. And they would just do that on on repeat. This was $100+ million a year corridor that, of remittances into Malawi. So that's the end of the kind of the good times. I'll just, conscious of time, but like share a little bit of what happened next. So as I mentioned, we were on top of the world, and then suddenly we experienced the macroeconomic shock of a currency depreciation. So the graph on the right is the Zambian kwacha versus the US dollar in 2015. It started at 6 to 1, it ended at 14 to 1. Why this mattered to us is that at the time, 90% of our revenue was in Zambian kwacha, and our investment was in dollars. We had debt from senior lenders in dollars. We had salaries in South African rand, where we were building a technology team. And we went from being a profitable business, growing at like 200% a year. 6 weeks later, we couldn't make payroll, and we almost died. And it was just this real eye-opening experience around dealing with the macroeconomic shock that was completely outside of our control. Luckily, we had amazing investors that bailed us out. It provided us a bit of a bridge funding, and then we said, we really need to go and raise a proper balance sheet to cushion us against these shocks, because when you're building businesses in emerging markets, like everybody knows that they will probably happen at some point. You just don't know when and what the trigger is going to be. And so we raised $15 million Series B round in 2016. Again, this was the very leading edge of some of the venture funding that was going into Africa. It was a big round at the time. And what we did at that point was we really quickly tried to diversify into new markets. And it was driven by, even though the fundamentals in our Zambia and Malawi business were strong, we were very worried about currency. Our investors were pushing us to expand. We launched in Mozambique. We built a big team. We were burning between $500,000 and $800,000 a month of cash. So the kind of business from these humble roots, now this was like a 200-person headcount business in 3 countries. The stress levels were through the roof. And for whatever reason in Mozambique, it completely failed. So that graph in Malawi, that the first year took 4 years in Zambia. In Mozambique, we sunk $6 million virtually for no revenue. The regulation was challenging in Mozambique, where we had to launch through a banking partner that was difficult to work with. The consumer behavior was very different. People didn't want to send and receive money like they did in Zambia and Malawi. People wanted to store money and save it, and we didn't, because of the regulation, we weren't allowed to offer a wallet or a savings product. And we had these really hard investor targets linked to all the funding we had raised, that if we didn't expand quickly into Mozambique and hit these milestones, the money was going to dry up and we'd go bankrupt. So we just kept plowing more and more money at higher stress levels into the country to try to make it work, and ultimately had to wave the white flag and then pull out completely. And just like a very humbling lesson of a market expansion failure. And at that point, so this was like back in 2017. So we withdrew from Mozambique. We luckily were able to negotiate with some of our investors again to bail us out and keep us going. And then we kept the business in Zambia and Malawi was still strong, even though we were putting all of our money to diversify. The currency had stabilized. We'd grown to a point where in Zambia, a quarter of the adult population was an active customer of Zona. So we were serving over 2 million people. The business was transacting like $80 million a month. So this was like, we had a really sizable operation in both of these countries, even though we were putting all of our effort and money trying to expand. And the thing that really inspired me when I started, we got through this like stressful period, was we realized that all of the early agents that we had set up had turned into like these thriving entrepreneurs that were creating like jobs and income for their families. And so this is a picture of this woman, Masozi, who started with us when she was 22 years old. She had a high school diploma, and she was one of our very first agents. And then 6 years on, she's 28 years old, but she had grown to employ 40 people, and she was turning over $1 million a month in cash. And it was just because this flywheel of the business model was working so successfully in Zambia. And I had actually lost touch with these agents and these customers at this point in the story, because I had spent so much time like fundraising and dealing with investors and boards and management challenges and just like the internal politics of running a 200-person team and failed expansion. And so I took a month off, and I spent a month just getting back on the ground, visiting our agents and customers, working with them, living with them, eating with them. And I learned like so much in this experience. And what I actually found was that it's these situations where you actually sit down and share a meal with your customers, your agents, your partners, that the real feedback happens, especially like if you're a foreigner, right? So getting to a point where the customers could and our agents could share with us like what it was that they loved about Zona, but what it was that really frustrated them, and the things, whether it's the product or the model or the supports that wasn't working for them. And it really rejuvenated our business, and it allowed us to develop this new business proposition that we called Zona Plus, that we launched in the market to be a fully fledged like digital bank. So back to that like original vision we had around a 10% interest savings product, which was first in the market, free money transfers, 7, 14, and 30-day liquidity loans, no monthly fees. It was available on an Android app, a new brand, and we set off to actually go on the fundraising journey again, and raise a $40 million investment, because we had like this amazing team, and we really felt like we had like gone through these huge cycles where it's that was a lot of my experience at Zona is putting all of your effort into something and then getting knocked back and then getting back up and doing it again and getting knocked back, and it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back the whole way. And so this Mozambique failure was very humbling, but we got re-energized to go do it again. And this leads to the kind of the ending of this story, and why ultimately the book I ended up writing was called Failing to Win. Because right as we were on the cusp of this next wave of launching this Zona Plus product, the telcos struck back again. And this time MTN, they had been slowly building up in the market, but not really making much traction. So they launched that original attack 5 years earlier. We were coexisting in the market, but Zona had about an 80% market share. So we were very strong. And then MTN launched in 2018 what they called a carpet bombing attack. So everywhere we had a kiosk, they rolled out 10 yellow ones right next door to ours, literally in a row like this. It was just like a big company saying, we have more money than you, and we're going to snuff out your brand. Then Airtel, the MTN competitor, matched them and did the same thing. And you can spot the little green Zona kiosk, which has been standing on the street corner of Lusaka for years at this point, and suddenly is sandwiched between a dozen MTN, a dozen Airtel kiosks. And this was the case in every single corner of like the capital city, Lusaka, and then some of the other major towns in the country as well too. And so it was just, we had built this market and this customer base, and these big competitors then came and just each of them threw about $50 million into Zambia and just like aggressively started taking our market share. And then ultimately this catalyzed what became a death spiral for the company that we barely got out of. We did survive in the end. But we had this other thing that was happening where we were trying to raise this investment round, and then we had an investor that partly got spooked by the competition, but also went through a management change very, very late in the round and pulled out. And we got ourselves in a position where we had a high fixed cost base. We were trying to compete against 2 telcos, and we couldn't get the funding. And we ended up in the last year I was there, shrinking down from like 200 staff down to less than 40. We lost about 90% of our revenue, and we had to really restructure and put the whole company just like go back into startup mode again to save the business and try to make sure that we could salvage what was left of it. So I know that there'll be lots of questions from people, but I'll just share 3 brief hard-earned lessons that I got from this experience. And as I mentioned, and I'm sure you saw in the book, the initial part of the talk, I ended up writing a book, which is like the much more detailed version of this story. So this is the shorthand version, but it really took me some time to step back and reflect on this journey and everything I learned along the way. And what I realized as the first learning was that Zoona was very successful for a long time, and we really proved that a purpose-driven business can achieve both positive impact at scale and be commercially viable. And when we started, this was an unproven hypothesis. A lot of people would say you have to pick one or the other. You can either be a social enterprise or you have to be like a cutthroat, like profit-motivated business. But in like this very small market in Africa that was previously unknown, that was a cash economy, we ended up processing $2.5 billion of transactions. We served over 3 million consumers. We earned $86 million in revenue, and we generated $26 million in income for the 3,000 agents that were all independent entrepreneurs like Masozi, that story I told of the young woman who ended up growing to employ 40 people. Also, the Zambia economy went through a complete digital transformation that Zoona didn't end up becoming the winner in the market, but we were very much the market creator. And so, this were the statistics last year: a country of 18 million people, financial inclusion rates 59%. When we started, that was less than 10%. 65% of these people have an active digital financial service account. When we started, that was 0, right? So we ended up creating a market and that had a tremendous amount of impact and will continue to have impact. And this is very much an innovator's dilemma story, where I think we were the disruptors that ended up becoming, getting disrupted in the end. Lesson number 2, failing is not the same as being a failure. This was a very personal lesson I had to learn as an entrepreneur, because failing sucks. It's really hard. You have a huge confidence knock, right? And all of the people, like when things seem to be going well from the outside, everybody tells you, I heard the business is great, and I saw on LinkedIn you just raised this funding, and congratulations. But inside you feel very insecure. Things are always on fire. And then when you go through a very big public failure like we had at Zoona, you really, like, I certainly did, leave that situation feeling like a failure and look back and say, like, geez, that didn't end the way I wanted it to be. We thought we were, going to IPO on the stock exchange and become this huge success story and really continue this vision of a Pan-African, a cashless Africa and a Pan-African payments platform. And it took me a few months and just a lot of writing and reflection to really feel proud about what I built and what I achieved on the journey, and transforming an idea into a pioneering company with 250 employees, operating in these underserved frontier markets, channeling $35 million of investment from global investors into a fintech startup. And that was my original mission of connecting investors with entrepreneurs in Africa. And then I found my calling as a purpose-driven entrepreneur. And I really believe entrepreneurship is a calling. And I started to get the energy again to go do it again. And this is just a brief graph of the venture funding landscape in Africa. So these are just the last 3 years. So in 2019, $1 billion of global venture funding went into Africa for the first time. 2020, it was about $1.5 billion. In 2021, $4 billion of global investment went in. And back in, we raised our seed round in 2009, our Series A round in 2012. There aren't even any statistics of what the global venture funding was. And I'm very proud of playing a catalyzing role, making investors a lot more aware of the opportunities in Africa, the opportunities for both impact and commercial returns, and inspiring a lot of young entrepreneurs that are now building companies. And there's the innovation that is happening in the ecosystem in lots of countries in Africa is really exciting right now. And I feel it's the beginning of a new wave. leads me to my third and final lesson is that I've come to believe that like failure can really be a superpower if you embrace and learn from it. And this is what I kind of took from the experience of sitting down and saying, okay, well, what are the things that went well and that are almost like the timeless principles, both internally around building and managing a team and raising money and managing investors and board and business strategy. And then what are the failures that I wouldn't repeat again, or the things that I learned from these failures that I can take going forward and design a new company around. And so in the last year and a half, since COVID kicked off, I've created a new business. It's called Boost. It's a B2B commerce platform that's now operational in Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt. We're just starting a pilot in Egypt, so that's our newest market. And we're starting to scale very quickly, which is exciting. And the mission of the business is to help enable all of the convenient, what we call the convenience retailers, the mom and pop shops that are offline selling goods and services, primarily food, drinks, medicines, pharmacies, grocery stores. And this is $1 trillion economy in Africa that is still unbanked, that is still disconnected from the digital economy. But most of these people now have smartphones. They use them for Facebook and for WhatsApp and for chat and for YouTube. But the whole commerce and the business ecosystem around these informal markets is still very analog and manual. And Boost is going to play a leading role in digitizing this, and believe that we can be like a big platform that has a huge amount of impact, and use Zona as the version 1.0 of a business model that I think can be 10 times more impactful over the next decade. So I'm really excited about that. So with that, I will end my talk, open up to questions, but just wanted to say thank you again for having me. You can check out the detailed version of the book on Amazon and Audible and some of the other platforms. But yeah, please give Boost a follow and me a follow. So I'll hand it over to you, JP. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Normally, there'd be lots of applause if we were sitting in a room in a couple of years ago. So let's just assume, I'll be an economist, assume loud applause. And let's open it up for questions. We've got about 35 minutes for questions. Now, let me, a reminder, this is being recorded. I'd like to consider the possibility of handing it over to one or two people to ask their own questions, time and questions permitting. So let's play it by ear on whether we do that. I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege and start off with a question, which is, can you just explain a little bit more about how Zona is different from M-Pesa? Was it fundamentally the same business model, but in a different bit of Africa? Or was there some core difference in how you did things?
Yeah, great question. So at the time, totally different markets. So M-Pesa was, when we started, Kenya specific. There was no mobile money in Zambia, but the competitors I mentioned, MTN and Airtel, their models were almost the exact same. Right. So that model came into the market. The thing that Zona did very differently was we didn't focus on the consumer as our customer. We focused on the agent. So instead of the consumer having a mobile wallet, that they would digitize their money and then be able to digitally from their phone send money to another relative or a recipient that would receive it into their phone. In our model, the consumer could go up to the agent and do what we called an over-the-counter transaction. So they would give cash to the agent, and the agent would hold the phone and do that transaction. And it was at the time a very simple kind of workaround because we reasoned that the market wasn't ready for mobile money. Nobody was familiar with it. People, didn't have smartphones. They weren't used to this behavior change of like, I can use my phone like a digital bank account. People just wanted the simplest possible way to send and receive money. And we said, well, go to a green box and give that person in the green box cash. And that's the person that has the phone. And then what that meant is we focused all of our efforts as a company on selecting and training the right agents, providing like digital loans and floats to the agent, having the whole technology system and operating model like very focused on the agent. And that became a differentiator for many, many years, and really a secret sauce for the business that ended up outcompeting mobile money until the end, when the competitors launched so much money into the market and it kind of shifted the whole market. So Zambia today is pretty much M-Pesa, right? It ended up there, but the way we started was very different.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I've got a couple of more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience. So could I ask Grace Wang, who's a PhD postdoctoral research fellow from South Africa, can you turn on your camera and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your questions? You've got a good one. Grace, are you there? Oh, there you go. You're muted. You're muted. Oh, sorry. No, you're not connected yet. We seem to be having a technical issue. Grace, I'm going to read your question. Sorry, just because it's not connecting to audio for some reason. We can see you, but we can't hear you. I'm sorry about this. So let me just read your question. So Grace is a postdoctoral research fellow from South Africa, Stellenbosch University, currently doing research in South Africa on the digital economy and innovation. And her question is, what do you think of African governments, Mike? What do you think of African governments, both national and local, their role in connecting global investors with local entrepreneurs?
Yeah, another great question. So I think one of the challenges of any entrepreneur in Africa is dealing with both regulation, but a whole bunch of stuff around, just like what I guess the broad thing was the enabling environment, but it's ease of setting up a business, it's tax regimes, it's the ease of taking money from outside, of expatriating profits, and you have to become quite an expert in these things, and they're different in every single market. And some of the leading countries, like South Africa is actually a particularly challenging market, but there are a couple of the investment funds now that are trying to create a startup act to make it easy, or to create an act of parliament that allows like startup businesses to flourish, makes it easier for investors to come in, skip around some of the exchange control laws that have been there and kind of legacy from a different era in South Africa. And so I think the government's really like policies should be around enabling innovators, enabling investment to come in, making it, ironically, the easiest way for money to come into a country is making it easier to come out. And that's one of like the real challenges in Africa, is like when you have countries that crack down on expatriating profits, often with good intent. What it then means is then the investors avoid investing in that market, or they have to set up like very complicated offshore entities and structures that become a big tax on actually just the business. And so we experienced this running like a Pan-African business where we had like entities in Zambia and Malawi and South Africa, and we had to raise all of our money in Mauritius because it was the only place that we could take in global investment. Nobody would actually invest in one of those markets locally. So that's what I would really encourage. And then maybe one other thing is just the environment between countries and like the SADC region, like Southern Africa Development Community, or like I think creating these trade corridors and regional partnerships and collaboration between markets can go a long way. It's done a huge amount of good in East Africa, where you have like the East African community, which allows companies that you can start in Kenya and then you can go into Uganda and Tanzania and Rwanda really easily. You don't necessarily need visas to move around. So I think there's like a huge role government can play to like foster innovation and just create the enabling environment without being an actor, which is generally where they trip up. Great, thank you. Thanks to both of you. There are questions coming in from different sources, some in the chat that you can see and some coming in from YouTube. So let me try to kind of bring several together. And this has to do with
with the skills that you picked up or the skills that you needed to be an effective CEO in a startup. So several people asked something like, you were an engineer before, would it have been beneficial for you to have real business experience, managing as opposed to as an engineer? And then before you got into Zona, and then related to that, looking back, what were the skills that you used most and what were the skills you wish you'd had in terms of making Zona a success?
Yeah, very good questions. So I think when you are a founder and entrepreneur, there's nothing that replaces just the day-to-day like experience from doing it and from learning. And often like the trait of an entrepreneur is just risk-taking, right? It's the ability to start and to not wait for something to be figured out, to pursue opportunity without regard to the resources that you control. It's like classical definition of entrepreneurship. And so I think you need to have that, you can learn it. Some people it's more easier than others, and not everybody has necessarily that entrepreneurial gene. And you can learn so much from other founders and mentors and books and blogs. Like a lot of the startup playbook has been demystified now. Because it's you don't have to just learn it all on the fly by yourself, which a lot of what I did early on was just figuring it out from the get-go. And I think it took 3 or 4 years of just trial and error and failing a lot to learn some very basic things that my second company I know right away, but like anybody graduating now could take a course or find a mentor or read another startup book and probably be much farther ahead. But when you're starting to scale a company, you definitely need professional management because like being a founder is different from being a manager. And the good things that make you a successful founder often become your undoing as a manager when you're starting to scale like the team, the culture. You need to have like performance systems. You deal with a lot of the internal politics that, as much as everybody says they hate politics in an organization, they're always there. Like all of these complex challenges. And I think, to the second part of your question, JP, is like the skills that I've had to develop are a lot around like letting go and managing people by just recruiting very well, like finding people that are values and mission aligned, but are extremely competent, are fit to the role, are incentivized, and then getting out of their way. Because when you start off a business, you're doing everything by yourself, and then you hire good people, and then the tendency is to like micromanage, and then the good people leave. So I've had to learn a lot of those skills. And then the second thing I would say is just the power of like networks, which is a thing that you get at like attending LSE. So I learned like great analytical skills. I learned a lot of like really interesting things from the lectures, but the thing that kind of keeps coming back to me and keeps growing is the network that I gained at LSE, and being able to connect the dots and find like whether it's you're recruiting or you're hiring or you're looking for partnerships or you're looking for insights or mentors. And I think as a leader, that skill of networking and just like it's relationship building. It has to be very authentic, but you no longer need to build a company where you vertically integrate. It's really about putting the components together and connecting a lot of dots and just finding the right people and partners to align to like a vision you have or to an objective you have. So a lot of soft skills. The one thing you'll see in the book too is like when the bulk of the book is the 8 biggest failures we had at Zona. And there's some like business failures around strategy and stuff, but like a lot of it is around like failing to like work well as a co-founding team and failing to have a functional board. So many people dynamics, failing to scale culture when you have like a great startup culture and then suddenly you hire 50 people and then everybody comes with these different backgrounds. So I learned a lot of like the soft skills and ate a lot of humble pie, I think, in the process.
Great, thank you. I'm going to insert one more of my questions, which is about this tension that you were referring to between going aggressively for growth and taking more risks versus sort of stability and keeping the business afloat. This is a classic sort of, the mantra about moving fast and breaking things that we've learned from Silicon Valley seems to kind of summarize that. So how do you balance these two perspectives? I mean, looking back now on what you tried to do, you plural in Zona, and what actually happened, how do you balance these two things?
Yeah, it is so hard. I don't think that there's a right way of doing it, but the one thing that I would start with is it's really determined the day you take outside investment and who those investors are, right? And because there's a saying that is a lot of entrepreneurs will know, but it's very true that like you actually sell your company the day you take venture capital investments, not at the end. Because even if you don't give up like control in a shareholding perspective, you're giving up a lot of influence. And if you find an investor that is pushing you to grow, you're going to grow. Like that's what you're going to do, right? And if it's like a grow at all cost mentality, and there's a lot of startups that do this, and I've talked to a lot of investors that I pitched to, and there was a situation I had a couple of months ago, pitching to a Silicon Valley investor, cut me off 8 minutes through and said, I don't care about any of this stuff. Just tell me how you're going to get as big as possible and burn as much cash as possible. And I don't want to hear anything about being profitable because that's bad for me. I just want market share, right? So you find an investor like that. It sounds crazy, but like that's like the unicorns that you hear about. And it is this mentality of just finding, like, sink as much money into something as possible, grab the market share, and then your valuation grows. And then, you either IPO or you exit, or you have the PR story that kind of keeps the wheel rolling. But it's very rare because it's most of the businesses will fail trying to do that. They will hit a wall or they won't get the money. But then on the flip side, if you're too conservative, and this was a lesson we learned at Zona, I think at the end, is we just pivoted and it evolved way too slow. So the time where we really needed to double down and go, like, really go for it in our core markets, we were trying to expand prematurely, and we needed like that big balance sheet to compete with the telcos that were coming in to grab our market share, and the market was moving, and we kind of were relying on an old business model. So I don't think that there's a right answer. It's very much like a blend of art and science and like intuition and judgment. So I would just say, like, choose your investors very wisely, and know that who you have as investor is going to push you into one path or another, and have like a really good set of advisors who are aligned with you and can give you real and honest advice, right? And I had this, and I've always been fortunate to kind of have great mentors, and to have different mentors that can give you different, sometimes conflicting advice, because you have to make your own decisions. But you have to ultimately be able to, especially as a CEO, is like filter all the things that everybody else tells you should do, because everybody will give you opinions and advice, and then you have to make the call, and then you have to live with it. And there's no right answer, and you could succeed or fail no matter what you do. That's kind of one thing I've learned. So you also just have to be comfortable, picking a path, and then you can also change your path if it doesn't work. You have to pivot fast.
Related to that, it's curious to me the different experiences that you describe in the different countries. So I work a lot in Latin America, and non-Latin Americans tend to look at the region and say, well, they all speak Spanish or Portuguese. From the outsider's perspective, they all kind of look vaguely alike, so they must all be the same. Similarly, a non-African could say, well, they're a bunch of countries that were colonized by a few European powers and have similar history, so they must all be the same. And yet the third country you tried to expand into that you described, Mozambique, you had completely different results from the first two, where the second one was 4 times faster in terms of reaching critical mass than Zambia. So are these countries really that different from one another, or is that experience in Mozambique down to sort of the business, the way that you try to grow the business there? Yeah. Is it managerial specifics, or are the underlying customers, do they really have such different preferences?
Yeah. So what I've learned is that I believe that the underlying needs are very ubiquitous in all African countries, and I would actually extend that to all emerging markets. So when you're working in like informal economies, like, you know, people need to be able to move money. Small businesses need to pay their suppliers and need to be able to order, you know, products at good prices. Like there's some fundamental truths that are just common pain points and desires and needs and even ambitions. Like when you visit and you kind of tap into different cultures, like people want to be successful and gain status in their community and support people, and like a lot of these I think are very true. But the environment and the context, or like, you know, what I would have learned from LSE is like the institutional arrangements in each country and within each country are very, very different. And one of the things that we didn't get right in Mozambique is like, well, we took a model in Zambia, we went into Malawi, shared language, shared political past. Like the Malawians and Zambians would even say they're cousins with each other. Zona translated, like it's the root of the word comes from Malawi, both like ex-English colonies, English law. Then you go into Mozambique, it's Portuguese law. The environment, like geographically and the need are very similar, but even like dealing with the regulation, the legal structure is completely different. And we didn't have a good enough team because we didn't intently go and require that team because, you know, to your previous question, we just raised all this money and we were being pushed to move fast, right? So we had our existing team that was like used to setting up in Zambia and Malawi, that we kind of exported a model into Mozambique rather than incubating something with Mozambican partners and founders from the ground up to really understand how things work in that economy. And I believe like our model, we could have been very successful in Mozambique if we had actually gone in a lot slower. And one of the things I've done in my new company, Boost, is, you know, to rectify this is I'm based in London with two co-founders, and we have a platform that is really a shared service center for all of the scaling infrastructure that can be centralized around capital raising and building technology and like back office of the business. But we have local co-founders in each market we work in that are the owners of the businesses locally. So they're not employees. They're not people that we just hire to go, you know, execute our playbook. They're real founders in their markets, but they're from those markets, from those communities. They're well networked. They have the local connections, and they can help us understand the intricacies. And I just before this, I was on a call with our Nigeria team. Right, and the differences between like Eastern and Western and Northern and Southern Nigeria, and even like in Lagos, like the island in Lagos and the mainland are enormous. The customers are pretty much the same. Like our product will work everywhere, our technology will work everywhere, but we're learning that the marketing and the value proposition and the language and like some of the intricacies really, really matter. And if you can combine those two together, like where you have like something in a model and a platform that can scale with real on the ground local insights, and you can adapt it. That's where I think the sweet spot is. But it's one of these things that's hard to do in practice. It's just a lot of trial and error.
Right. Great. Thank you. We've got a question. Let me ask Bremley to turn on his camera and mic. So we've got a question from Bremley Lingdo about ecosystem services.
Mike, thank you so much. That was pretty amazing. I just love what you do, and I wish it was a different story, and I wish that crash of currency didn't happen and all that, but amazing work. The question is, you know, I've been working on restoration of ecosystems at large scale in Africa, Asia, Latin America. It is the UN decade for ecosystem restoration, and a lot of people say if we don't do anything for the planet in this decade, it will breach the tipping point by 2030. But this carbon market is not for smallholder farmers, only for big boys with big farms and big tenure rights. So the small guys lose out. They can never get a fair share of the carbon revenue, or what we can call payment for ecosystem services. From your experience, given what you've done in Africa, do you think it's possible to inspire farmers to go regenerative to sequester more carbon and use some kind of new technology, whether it's satellite verification and so on, because we can't send consultants who charge a huge fee for project development and stuff and pay them directly into these existing wallets once verification is done of actual land, actual produce to market, actual sequestration from trees planted, and reward them a fair price that they would get like in Europe. Like in Europe, the carbon price almost hit $100 per ton. Now with the war in Russia, it went down by $20, but still there is a large need for restoring. And there's talk about the Great Green Wall in Africa, but I think this is the best way to beat corruption, because there's lots of projects, but they're not delivering because the money doesn't reach the people who are actually the keepers of the land, or the people that maintain the integrity of these ecosystems that could then collapse and trigger wars and migration to Europe and elsewhere, So what do you think?
Yeah, so lots to unpack there, and I'm not an expert in carbon market, but I think what you started with, Bremley, and what I think everybody is now learning with what's happening in Russia is how fundamentally important payments are, right? Like payments are so critical to so many things happening. And if there's payment infrastructure in place, then there's a whole bunch of things that you can build on top of that. So what in Kenya, the impact M-Pesa has had is enormous, but it's actually it's a fraction of the impact, because now there's an entire ecosystem that has been built on top of M-Pesa to provide a whole bunch of services that nobody would have imagined were possible 10 years ago, right? And like in Russia with decoupling from SWIFT, you see how much of a pain, like how painful it is to actually take away a payments system and how it can destroy an economy. So like when the carbon innovations were starting to happen in Africa a few years back, the payment infrastructure was not yet mature enough. And so largely they were like super small or very niche. It was like people that would go in and you sign up 10 farmers and just give them a wallet and then try to like do something small, but like nothing would scale because you didn't actually have the infrastructure in place. Whereas that is now changing. A lot of that $4 billion of investment that I said went into Africa last year, the majority of that was fintech. It's still like really a drop in the ocean compared to the size of the opportunity and the problems in the market. But we are getting to a point where in the next 5 to 10 years, like everybody's going to have a mobile phone or multiple phones, a mobile wallet, and payments are probably going to be free, including in Africa, right? So then it comes down to like the real, like the value proposition for the user. So if you went today to a smallholder farmer in Africa and said, you should change your behavior because you should care about climate change. Like, to be honest, most people would say like, I don't care. I just care about growing my crop and feeding my family. This is like a problem that's outside of the world, in the Western world. But if you have a value proposition to say like, if you change your behavior and you will get paid this and your income grows, then it becomes very powerful, right? And that's how people will change the behavior. So I think it's really like, I view this as like aligning the incentives and putting yourself in the shoes of the user, like not trying to morally justify why somebody should do something, but just trying to understand what are their pain points and how do you help them, and then how do you align that to kind of like solving a bigger problem. But I do see huge potential, because there are payment systems that are getting like real scale in Africa now that are going very rural and very grassroots, and that trend is going to continue. And blockchain and crypto like makes it even easier, right? Because you can tokenize like anything these days.
Exactly, that's what we're doing with Earth Bank. And you mentioned Revolut, so we want to make this like the green Revolut, but actually rewards people that are restoring ecosystems rather than to create this new economy of regeneration or regenerate rather than extractive. So especially to talk about these green jobs for young people in remote areas, how to create value for them, for organic products and so on. And I think this is the way, is transparency and credible payments, which cuts out the loan sharks and the corrupted politicians, if we can do that.
Well, I'm going to throw one more statistic in here. So like right now, Africa's got 1.3 billion people. The average age is 19. So there's a huge number of people that are kind of coming of age and moving into like the formal workforce. And there's going to be 700 million people added in Africa in the next 18 years. That's like the expected population increase, which is 2 times the size of the United States, right? So if you think of the problems that's going to cause, it's like almost mind-boggling. But the opportunities of like generating income, like anything that I think can generate income and jobs, that doesn't do like harm to the planet or fuel corruption or something, is going to be net positive. And we can't rely on the governments or big companies to actually absorb that many people, right? That most of those people are going to be self-employed, working in the informal economy, and it's going to get more and more competitive for them. But I feel like that is like a real opportunity, that if you can do things that put more money in people's pockets, it will be helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Take care.
Thank you both. Let me ask Harinirina Rakut, who's a 2017 MSc Management Science graduate from Madagascar. Just don't worry about the camera. I think you don't have a camera, but let's forget about cameras anyway. Let's just, to conserve bandwidth, if you just turn on your mic and pose your question. Harinirina, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So the question is really, at the beginning of your business, how did you shape your very first business model and business plan? Because I know it's quite a sensitive area and quite demanding. So did you rely on experts? And if not, at what stage do you recommend to rely on experts on finance and so on?
Great, thank you for your question. So I think the trick with starting a new business, or the way I like to think about it, is to start with a big picture and a big problem, and something that you care a lot about, you're very passionate about, that intersects with your expertise or your knowledge or your learned experience, right? So it's really hard to say like I care about something, but then you don't know anything about it. You probably need to go spend 5 years like learning about that space. But if you can find like a problem that you know is really big, but you've experienced it personally or you've worked in it, that is like a really good starting point. And finding something big is important, because if you have small problems, they won't really scale. You'll hit a wall eventually. And if you don't really care about it, you'll run out of energy, because so much of the source of any company is like from the founders and from the entrepreneurs. And I like to think about, my processes is what, like, I wouldn't do anything unless I'm going to commit to it for at least 10 years. So I kind of start at that level. But then to the practical part of your question is, when you then start, you have to start really small. And again, this has been demystified. So there's a great book called Lean Startup by Eric Ries, which tells you all about like the MVP or like building a minimum viable product and testing. And you don't need a website. You don't need to hire like an engineering team. You don't need to even build a product. A business can start by going and talking to like 10 people and having pieces of paper, sticky notes, and just like understanding, like iterating with them of what like an initial pilot or prototype could look like. And then iterating up from there. Bringing in experts at the early stage is actually, I think, more harmful than it is positive, because experts tend to come with a lot of external knowledge or the way things work, whereas when you're starting something, you really want to challenge common knowledge and just like go on a discovery phase. So I would actually avoid using experts unless there are experts that are on the founding team that are committing to like use their expertise to change the way something works. That's maybe the exception. And then once you have something that's where you have like a product market fit, or your business is starting to scale on its own, that's when like experts become very valuable, because then you bring in people that really know what they're doing, and you can hire them to like grow your company. there's a lot of science around this. So I do think like reading some startup books can advance your knowledge and your learning curve by a couple of years. So you don't have to actually do all of this by yourself from scratch.
Great, thank you. We're coming up to 4 o'clock, but I think there's time for one more question. So let me ask Jaya Yung Mahat, who's from Nepal, to pose his question about fintech.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Jaya.
So I think just before asking my question, just to give you a context. So before COVID hit us, so Nepal, in case of Nepal, so I think there are so many technological firms and entrepreneurs who are pushing for integrating technology in major fintech platforms. But the government was not listening very seriously. But when COVID came and physical restrictions become a reality, so government itself, they came up with so many other plans, and the growth of fintech platforms during past 2 years in Nepal has been phenomenal. So in a similar context, so I think we can relate that there must be same case in case of Africa as well. And COVID is still kind of evolving, and we cannot say when it's going to end, right? So given these realities, and how do you see the overall fintech landscape in the context of Africa going forward in the coming years? And in addition, what do you think would be the key things or key policies that the governments in Africa needs to do so that these developments move in a good direction in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, and great to hear the ecosystem in Nepal is evolving as well. You're very right. In Africa, it is moving very quickly, and the ecosystem is emerging. And the Zona story, we were competing against telcos because there were no other real startups in our space. But now the amount of like new startups and new companies and young people that are starting businesses and raising money globally is really phenomenal and very encouraging. So I believe that will continue. I think it's just the very early phases of a wave. And as there's lots of work to do like everywhere in the world, but like Africa is very much like a virgin opportunity for investors, both from the East and the West. So I think people will like kind of continue to invest more and more in search of like new opportunities and new returns, which is generally net positive. Like there will be some failures and bubbles as there always are. I think that the risk I see from a government perspective that's actually happening now is governments in Africa tend to have a short-term perspective where they as soon as something becomes successful, they want to tax it. So this in Ghana, there's a discussion now about a mobile money tax. And this happened in Nigeria. There was they shut down the cryptocurrency exchanges. They shut down ride hailing in Lagos. And like, especially with mobile money taxes, like it seems like when everybody's using a service, it's like, it's making a lot of money and you can put like a tax on it. It's a very quick win for the government to make revenue, but that immediately increases fees to consumers. And then what often happens is it just takes like all the consumers at the bottom of the pyramid that you've just brought onto the digital ladder and then takes them back off. So they go back into like informal. And so I think governments really need to like take a long-term view on this and think about like not what is the quickest way to tax now or find like the quick wins for revenue, but to like think about like building the ecosystem and turning China's. I would say China is a good example, but there's lots of like bad things in China. So it's kind of hit or miss, but like there are some like companies like with Alipay and Financial that have got like enormous scale, right? That have done enormous amount of good for small merchants and consumers. But also like there's a lot of things around like credit scoring and like a lot of too much government control that I think is dangerous. So yeah, I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think putting more faith in the entrepreneurs and just not making it harder, like making it easier for entrepreneurs to start and to build businesses and for investors to fund them. Anything that kind of makes it harder generally has like worse long-term impacts. It's my belief.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. It's just gone 4, so I should really draw this to a close.
Yeah.
I want to thank all of you for sticking with us, and thanks especially to Mike. This is such a dramatic story with dramatic ups and downs, but I think at bottom it's a really hopeful story, and it's a really hopeful experience you've given us. So thank you for that. Again, this will be available, it will live on indefinitely on the internet, on YouTube, in the department's channel. So again, please assume applause. Thank you so much, Mike. And best wishes to you all.
Great. Thank you, everybody.